Good afternoon. Let me first begin by thanking the organizers of this conference for inviting me to take part. My name is Bakker. I work with the Department of Anthropology of the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. I will speak about the role of culture and COVID in considering surf tourism as it is developing and has been developing in the Mentawai Islands in West Sumatra in Indonesia. And I'll be speaking specifically about these islands because, well, they are first of all quite well known for surfing. And second, because I believe that COVID has had quite some influence in how surfing is taking place there at present. So to briefly start off, I do believe that most of the people in the audience will know where the Mentawai Islands are and why they are famous. Strictly speaking, the element that comes to the fore here is that the Mentawai are world famous for having some of the best wave breaks that exist on the planet. There are few places that have waves as Mentawai has. Firstly, because they are quite consistent. Secondly, because they are very large. I have to say I am not a surfer myself, but friends of mine who are literally told me that they fell in love with the waves in Mentawai and that they are wonderful, beautiful, and that they are very worthwhile to visit. So it means that surfers from everywhere in the world flock to Mentawai to enjoy these waves. And as said, there's quite a few places where these waves can be enjoyed. You can see some of the various breaks on the map in the right hand of this slide. And as you can see, there are quite a few. So if waves are not so good in one place, it's quite possible to travel to one of the other breaks and enjoy the wave over there. There is one but that goes with this, and that is, of course, the number of tourists that can come to surf. Globally speaking, there are more surfers than there are breaks. And one of the things that is happening is that popular and easily accessible waves are getting more and more crowded, overcrowded, some claim. Mentawai so far has, in my understanding, not been victim to overcrowding. Two reasons for that. The first reason is that it is still relatively difficult to get there. The second reason is that Mentawai tourism has until fairly recently been marketed as a special class, expensive, and as well limited edition, to put it that way. That means that most of the resorts on the Mentawai Islands ask prices of $100 and upwards per night. It also means that quite a few of the resorts until recently have been working hard on limiting the number of surfers that would be able to access a specific waves. If one looks into the recent history, what one sees is there's a lot of tensions between resorts, surf boats, and to some extent also locals about who can bring guests, surfers, to a specific break and allow them to use that wave. So the idea is that the number of tourists should be limited so that they can actually really enjoy the place and are willing to pay for that. And recently, the Mentawaian government has started facilitating that by introducing tourism management schemes and a specific tourism tax as well. And I think they actually may be onto something there. Because if those waves are so wonderful, yeah, it would be kind of a pity if it would not be Mentawai that benefits from this. So, as said, there is a fair number of tourists that visit Mentawai. The surfing tourism contributes to the PAD in substantial numbers, but probably something that could be worked out better. And importantly, and as one sees, that's why I added those numbers, the number of tourists, specifically surfers also visiting Mentawai, is increasing steadily, both foreign tourists and national tourists. And the numbers I could find for 2002 showed a tremendous rise, which apparently is due to national tourists, but it also shows a tremendous drop here in March due to the COVID beginning and anti-COVID measures starting to take place. Now, when those tourists come to Mentawai, this is also something that is important to keep into mind. They will need to stay somewhere. And I mentioned the resorts. What you see here is an overview of resorts available in the Mentawai Islands. It may be the case that there are actually more places to spend the nights. It may be that not all of them were actually listed in this overview. But there are a number of relatively expensive resorts. There are various local Penginapan, more simpler places run by local Mentawaians, which are starting up. But importantly, there's also a number of surf boats, as you see over here. And those are literally boats. They pick up their customers, usually in Padang, travel over to Mentawai, anchor near the surf breaks, have their guests enjoying the breaks, and literally they do not have to come ashore in Mentawai. So this is another type of business which is actually largely offshore and whose customers may actually not ever get into the mainland of Mentawai simply because they are there for the waves and stay on the water. So those are the businesses, if you like, that are involved in surf tourism and that profit from this business. And it may be important to point out here that a large number of these businesses are foreign run and foreign owned, possibly with Indonesian and Mentawaian partners, but the number of Mentawaian businesses is still very, very limited. So you can imagine what happens if these surfers, these tourists suddenly drop away. Does it have an impact on Mentawaian culture? And my first impression of this is that it hasn't. And I have to add here that obviously I've also not been in Mentawai for a long time. I've spoken to friends of mine in Mentawai, either via telephone or via WhatsApp, and they keep me a bit informed as to what's going on there. But generally speaking, surfing is not a part of Mentawaian culture. It is developing, though, into something that is popular among youngsters, teenagers, the generation that grew up with surf tourists along the coast, as it is in Nias, for instance, or in Bali. But for many Mentawaians, it doesn't mean very much. It only does so in certain coastal communities. It also means that it's important to take into account the ecological aspect that surfing might entail, this notion that surfing could be damaging, which generally is not the case, and it's not being perceived as such. But people do point out that, hey, hold on, we've got these surfers, all these surf resorts that use Mentawaian land, that is land on Mentawai, which may or may not be claimed as customary land by some of the clans over there. And as such, there is that notion, not so much for the surfers themselves, but for the resorts and the way in which they operate in Mentawai. So that raises two questions. Who is profiting from, benefiting from this Mentawai surf tourism? And how much is it in the way of the Mentawaian population at large? And to start with the latter, I do not believe that Mentawaians at large dislike surfing. There may be those who feel that they are being disadvantaged by it, for instance, because their land is part of resorts. But generally speaking, many of the Mentawaians I spoke to say, yeah, surfing, yeah, that's along the coast. So that should be interesting for people who want to go there. But we don't live there, so it's not really our problem. Many Mentawaians expressed the hope, though, that they, as a Kabupaten, would see more benefit from this tourism taking place. On the whole, there seems to exist a bit of a notion that there is profit being made, but that it does not so much benefit general purposes for the population at large. So there might, if it's not in perception or in reality, but there might still be a will to win there in that sense. And you might wonder why these happy people in this wooden shoes sit here. This is a picture from Amsterdam, where I work during the COVID pandemic. And obviously, there have been a tremendous drop in tourism numbers in Amsterdam as well. And many people in Amsterdam actually rather appreciate this because they say, like, well, all of a sudden, the streets are quite empty. There are not all these drunk people or stoned people in the center of town. I can actually get to know my neighbors because I have the time to meet them, and it's so much quieter at night. So basically, what people pointed out is like, well, tourism is one thing, but we do not want all types of tourists. We don't want the drunk and the noisy ones. We want the ones that come for the culture and generally that are not annoying for us as a population. So the question then that stands out is which tourists would people in Mentawai want to see? Would those be surfers or others? And again, a question that also pertains to Amsterdam, if there is so much tourism, who benefits? Who are the people that gain the income? In Amsterdam, quite often, it's not the people who live in the city center who bear the brunt of the presence of all the tourists. How does that work out for the people living around the resorts in the Mentawai Islands? So, in terms of culture, I believe surfing, as I mentioned, is not so much a part of Mentawaian culture per se, but one thing that tourism does and has been doing for quite some time is boost, if you like, Mentawaian confidence or Mentawaian pride. In the 70s and 80s, a cultural tourism aimed at the traditional culture of Mentawai started to develop. And this was in a time when many of the groups living in the interior, specifically of the island of Siberut, were often being considered as primitive, uncivilized, behind in more official discourse. But the fact that tourists came there and wanted to see those shamans and wanted to get an understanding of how people managed to live in the middle of the forest and made a living out of that, also showed that there was an interest and some admiration possibly for Mentawaian culture among those foreign people. So whereas on the one hand, there would be pressure exerted on Mentawaians from outside to change, there would be another impact from outside, from Mentawaians saying, ooh, look, this is interesting what you're doing. And I believe that that worked for Mentawaian or Mentawai as an area in two ways. Basically, to bring to forth this notion of what might be Mentawaian culture and how that may or may not survive, what is important in it, what is not. That's a bit of an interior debate, which I will not go into so much here. But since Mentawai has become a kabupaten in itself, it also brings to the fore the question as, well, how much of Mentawai is run by Mentawaians and serves Mentawaian influence, and how much is aimed at the outside of Mentawai and perhaps benefits interests that sit outside of the Mentawai Islands. So in that sense, what benefits Mentawai in a cultural, but also in an economic sense, and a political one, is being raised to the fore, in my opinion, by this disappearance of tourists and their likely return in the not too far off future. Of course, one can also wonder, what is the resilience of surf culture in this? But I don't think that is really an issue. As I said, there are more surfers, globally speaking, than there are interesting waves. That means that it's more than likely that those people who enjoy surfing will return to Mentawai because the waves are so special. And indeed, there is this notion of surf culture as being something independent, not appreciating rules, like sometimes to hippie culture. But having said all that, the introduction of the surf tax that took place a couple of years ago was taken very, very easily by visiting surfers. And many actually appreciate this idea that there's money that definitely goes to Mentawai. So I don't think that either COVID or the increased control, if you like, that government has put on surfers so far has impacted the interest of surfers to come to Mentawai in any problematic way. So my guess is that on the whole, daily affairs in the surf industry, once it picks up again, will not be impacted by either of these. The important thing, of course, is now that this is going on and that surfers are not present and that jobs in the industry are also under pressure. How much of an impact does that have on livelihoods in Mentawai? We've all seen stories, or at least I believe many people have seen stories of tourism businesses in Bali or perhaps in Danau Toba, where people are severely impacted by the lack of foreign tourists coming to those locations. Fortunately, I believe the situation in Mentawai is not to that extent depending on tourism. Most Mentawaians still have a ladang or a field or a sago palms, or they may have other members of the family who have an income in certain ways. And that means that luckily, I believe, livelihoods in Mentawai are still quite diversified, which means that it's not like Bali, so heavily impacted by the lack of the arrival of foreign tourists. Perhaps one thing to mention here as well, it's not my idea, it's what a Mentawai friend of mine told me. He said, like, well, you know, we've had disasters here more often. We've had big earthquakes, we've had tsunamis. We as people in Mentawai are challenged more often. And this lack of tourists is just one other form of that, as is COVID. So what he says is, well, we are used to dealing with just things happening, and we can do that. If the threat here is a lack of income through surfing, well, then we find a livelihood elsewhere, through the crops we grow, through the sago we plant. On the whole, of course, it means a drop in income, both for individuals and for government. But it seems likely, I believe, that this will not form too much of a hindrance for people to continue their daily lives. Economically, of course, this is a different story. Surfing has been put to the fore as one of the larger ways in which Mentawai stands to develop an income as a kabupaten. And in that sense, you could say that we are perhaps looking at some sort of a resource curse, because it's a very specific resource. There's only one of it. It brings in a lot of money until the moment that it drops away. And then you're left without, and you need to look for something else. Well, and luckily, of course, the Mentawaian government is doing that as well. This picture over here illustrates to some extent a study on the usage of sago, possibly the notion that sago, of which there's a lot in Mentawai, can be developed on a more industrial scale. So other plans are being made. And luckily also, it's not as if Mentawai purely depends on tourism for its existence. However, what this could also signal, or perhaps could be used as, is a moment to go a step further with the way in which tourism takes place in Mentawaian life and Mentawaian politics. Culturally, I just argued its impact is not so large, except that people embrace it in the coastal communities, that they enjoy the presence of surfers, it seems, enjoy the income that it brings, and that for younger people, this attachment to surfing culture and more global ideas in that way seems to work out quite well. It could be that this is a way also for governments to think up like, well, what should the share of Mentawai and Mentawaians in this surfing business be? To what extent should it be foreign owned, or would it be a good idea if Mentawaians are assisted perhaps or helped further in setting up and developing tourism enterprises and resource? Would it be a question, therefore, to see if there would be a larger role for governments in the managing and the development of surfing tourism in Mentawai? And again, it was an idea that I thought about, but two of my Mentawaian friends actually put this to the fore, like, well, there is all this tourism. It's largely foreign run, foreign owned, which means the money that is being made does not stay in Mentawai, goes somewhere else. Wouldn't it be an idea to try and make it a more Mentawaian enterprise? So overall, what does all this mean? And my first question, I believe, is how much would this alter expectations, this absence of surfing tourists? And by alter expectations, I mean both expectations in serving tourists and expectations in Mentawaians of serving. And I believe that for both, it basically is, is a situation that is put on hold, but that neither exists with the idea that surfing is now gone, or that neither has a wish for surfing to be gone. And that possibly is a positive element because it raises the question of the more long-term impact of this absence of tourism. And I believe that there might be two things coming to the fore. It is possible, though of course not necessary, and I also do hope that is not the case, but if there is such a large number of resorts, it might be possible that some of them may need to discontinue their business because they lack customers. If so, that might be a way for Mentawai government to step in. Why would they do so? Well, simply for the income that can be generated, the Mentawai jobs that could be developed further here. Simply put, to have a larger share in the tourism industry as it is existing and developing because of surfing in Mentawai. I also believe, as I said, that Mentawai culture is not necessarily impacted in any way by this notion of surfing, except that it works to reinforce Mentawai identity as something that people might be proud of, and as a way that they see them Mentawai as a place that is different from other parts of Indonesia. I mentioned this notion of profits going to other parts of the world rather than staying in Mentawai is something that I encountered several times among my Mentawai contacts, and this notion that this actually disadvantages them, even though the resource is Mentawai in character. That, again, hails back to this notion of who controls and who benefits this industry. And in that sense, I believe that if we're talking about resilience, it makes sense to continue to consider this culturally, but that we should also consider the economic elements of such resilience, the political elements of such resilience, and as such, it has a multivariate aspect. Resilience can be something that is run, if you like, by culture. I mean, once a crisis comes to the fore, those elements within a culture that can deal with that crisis will become more prominent. But at the same time, resilience is something that shows the economic strength of a specific location or a culture, and perhaps its political relation to other parts of the nation, as well as to that specific resource that brings in its funding because it brings in tourism. And thus I would say that, well, if we're considering cultural resilience, it is quite important to also look at these broader elements, broader aspects that relate to it in terms of resilience. Okay, thank you very much. I will stop here. This is what I wanted to tell you. Thank you again for the invitation and for allowing me to speak.